Sofia Castillo stood in her office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the city. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, her phone buzzed, a message from her latest client, Carlos Rivera. Sofia hesitated for a second before opening it. Her mind raced. She had defended hardened criminals before, but none as dangerous or as charismatic as Carlos. Carlos Rivera, known in the underworld as El Tiburon, had been a key figure in the cartel for over a decade. Ruthless, cunning, and always one step ahead of the law, his empire had grown exponentially. When he was arrested 6 months ago on a minor charge, it wasn't long before the authorities realized they had their hands on one of the most wanted men in the country. But Carlos wasn't panicked. He knew his power reached far beyond prison walls. What he didn't expect was Sofia. From their first meeting, something clicked. Sofia, sharp and unrelenting, was different from the other lawyers who had represented him. She treated him not as a criminal but as a man whose case she had to win. That professional detachment fascinated him. But over the course of countless meetings in dimly lit rooms, late-night strategy calls, and long hours spent poring over case files, the lines began to blur. Sofia couldn't deny the magnetic pull she felt toward Carlos. His charm, his intelligence, it was intoxicating. She tried to push it away, reminding herself that he was dangerous, that she was playing with fire. But something in his dark eyes hinted at vulnerability, a past marred by circumstances beyond his control. She convinced herself that behind the ruthless drug lord was a man who had once believed in something better. Carlos, on the other hand, had never let anyone get close. His life was a fortress, and his heart even more so. Yet Sofia, with her intellect and unwavering commitment, broke through his defenses. He admired her strength, the way she stood up to him, refusing to be intimidated. Slowly, what had started as a professional partnership evolved into something much more dangerous. The lawyer and the drug lord were falling for each other. As the trial date approached, the stakes grew higher. Sofia found herself at a crossroads, torn between the law she had sworn to uphold and the man she was inexplicably drawn to. She could feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her. A relationship with Carlos could ruin her career. More than that, it could destroy her life. But walking away from him felt impossible. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting about the case, Carlos made his move. As Sofia gathered her papers, ready to leave, he stopped her, his hand gently grazing hers. She froze, the electricity between them palpable. He stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Sofia, you and I, we're the same. Both of us fighting, clawing our way to survive in this world. You understand me?" She looked into his eyes, and in that moment, the tension broke. They kissed, the passion and danger swirling around them like a storm. For the first time, Sofia allowed herself to surrender to the feelings she had been trying to suppress. But in the back of her mind, she knew there would be consequences. The next morning, Sofia woke with a pit in her stomach. This wasn't just a fling. It was a full-blown affair with a man who had enemies everywhere, and she was right in the middle of it. The trial was weeks away, and if Carlos lost, his rivals would take the opportunity to dismantle his empire. And if he won, what kind of future could they possibly have? As the trial began, the courtroom became a battlefield. Sofia fought tooth and nail to defend Carlos, but the evidence was damning. The prosecution painted him as a monster, responsible for countless deaths and the destruction of lives. Sofia, however, saw something different. She fought to humanize him, to show the jury the man behind the headlines. Every word, every argument was charged with the weight of their secret. But Carlos's enemies were watching, waiting for him to fall. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Sofia returned home to find a note slipped under her door. "Stay away from him, or you'll both regret it." Panic surged through her. They knew. She rushed to Carlos, confronting him about the note. He was calm, unbothered. "They won't touch you, Sofia. Not while you're with me." But she wasn't convinced. The danger was closing in, and she knew that she had to make a choice. She could either continue down this path with Carlos, risking everything, or walk away before it was too late. The trial ended in a hung jury, a small victory, but not enough to free Carlos. As they walked out of the courtroom together, Sofia knew this wasn't over. She looked at him, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carlos smiled, that dangerous glint still in his eyes. "Now we keep fighting. But this time, we do it together." Sofia nodded, but deep down, she knew the truth. Love with a man like Carlos wasn't just dangerous, it was lethal. The crosshairs were already on her, and she couldn't escape. The days after the trial were restless for Sofia. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Carlos, his dark gaze, the way he had looked at her in the courtroom as they walked out. He was free for now. But freedom for someone like Carlos was always fragile. His enemies would never rest, and the law, though temporarily stalled, would come for him again. Sofia knew it, and so did Carlos. They had barely spoken since the trial's conclusion, and that silence gnawed at her. She couldn't tell if it was relief or dread keeping her away. Her career was in tatters. Whispers about her questionable relationship with her client had started to circulate, and the note she'd received wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. She had stepped into a world where alliances shifted like sand, and one wrong move could end her life. One evening, just as the city's lights began to flicker on, Sofia's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was Carlos. She hesitated before answering, her breath catching in her throat. Sofia, his voice was low, smooth as ever, but there was something different now, a sharpness she hadn't heard before. "We need to talk." She met him at a secluded bar on the outskirts of the city, a place where prying eyes wouldn't follow. Carlos sat in the far corner, his posture relaxed but his eyes scanning the room, ever vigilant. As soon as she sat down, he leaned in, his expression serious. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My enemies, they know about us. They're planning something. You're not safe." Sofia's heart raced, but she kept her face neutral. "What do you mean? Who's coming after me?" Carlos clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around his glass. "The cartel's fractured since I got out. Some of my old allies don't think I should be walking free. They think I'm weak, and they know the easiest way to get to me is through you." For the first time, Sofia felt the full weight of what it meant to be involved with Carlos Rivera. It wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. She could feel the walls closing in, but it was too late to back out now. She had made her choice when she defended him in court, when she crossed that line from lawyer to lover. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Carlos stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "I'm getting out. I have a plan, but I need you to come with me." Sofia's breath caught. "Out? You mean, leave everything behind?" She hadn't expected this. She had thought Carlos would fight. He was a man who always fought. The idea that he wanted to flee, to disappear, was unthinkable. "It's the only way," he said quietly. "If I stay, they'll kill me. And if you stay, they'll kill you too." She didn't respond right away, her mind racing. Leave everything? Her career, her life, her identity, it would all be gone. But what was left for her here anyway? The legal community had already begun to turn its back on her, her reputation in ruins. If she stayed, she would become a target. If she left, she would be lost in a life she didn't know how to navigate, a life of shadows, running, and danger. Sofia met his gaze, seeing the raw intensity in his eyes, a mixture of desperation and something close to hope. Could she really do this? Could she abandon everything she knew and run off with a man who had blood on his hands? But then she realized, the decision had already been made the moment she kissed him. She had crossed the line, and there was no turning back now. "I'm with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Carlos leaned back, his relief palpable, though he didn't smile. There was no victory in this decision, only survival. "We'll leave tomorrow. Pack light. No phones, no cards. Just cash. I'll take care of the rest." Sofia nodded, but inside, her mind spun. Could she really disappear like that? Leave her entire life behind? She had no choice now. She had chosen Carlos, and with him came this new life, a life of constant threat. The next day was a blur. Sofia packed a small bag, her fingers trembling as she pulled clothes from her closet. She didn't allow herself time to think, didn't let the gravity of what she was doing sink in. By the time night fell, she was waiting, her heart pounding in her chest, for Carlos to pick her up. When he arrived, his car idling silently outside her apartment, he looked as calm as ever. But Sofia noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes constantly flickered to the rearview mirror. He was a man on the run, and now so was she. They drove through the night, the city falling away behind them as they headed toward the border. The roads were quiet, the moon casting long shadows on the asphalt. Neither of them spoke much, the weight of what they were leaving behind hanging heavy between them. It wasn't until they reached a small, run-down motel on the edge of a desolate town that Carlos finally broke the silence. "We'll stay here for a few days. Lay low until I can arrange something more permanent." Sofia nodded, exhaustion creeping into her bones. The adrenaline that had fueled her for the past 24 hours was wearing off, and all she wanted to do was sleep. But just as she began to relax, a knock on the door shattered the silence. Carlos stiffened, his hand moving instinctively to the gun tucked under his jacket. Sofia's heart pounded as he approached the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened it just a crack, enough to see who was outside. A man stood there, his face shadowed by the dim light. "We need to talk, Carlos," the stranger said, his voice cold, unmistakably threatening. "You didn't think you could run, did you?" Sophia's blood ran cold. They had found them already. Carlos' enemies were closer than she thought, and now, there was no escape. The motel room felt suffocating. Sophia's pulse quickened as she watched Carlos size up the man at the door. His calm, calculating demeanor was gone, replaced by something primal, survival mode. Without a word, Carlos stepped outside, leaving the door cracked open. Sophia strained to hear their conversation, but the blood rushing in her ears drowned out the muffled voices. Seconds stretched into minutes. She could feel the weight of the gun in her bag, an insurance Carlos had insisted on earlier, and now she understood why. The life she'd chosen with him wasn't about escaping. It was about preparing for the inevitable violence that followed him like a shadow. Suddenly, the tension outside broke. Sophia heard a grunt, a scuffle, and then the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. Her breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The door flew open, and Carlos rushed in, blood spattered across his shirt. He grabbed Sophia by the arm, pulling her toward the door without a word. "What happened?" she gasped, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the chaos. "He's dead," Carlos muttered, his voice hard. "They'll send more. We need to move. Now." Sophia's world spun. The reality of what she had stepped into hit her full force. This wasn't just a chase anymore, this was a war. The cartel wanted Carlos dead, and they would stop at nothing to make sure of it. She wasn't just on the run with him, she was now part of his fight for survival. They bolted for the car, the engine roaring to life as Carlos peeled out of the motel parking lot, tires screeching on the asphalt. The desert landscape blurred past them as they sped toward the Mexican border, but Sophia could barely focus on the road ahead. Her mind was consumed by one thought: this is my life now. Hours passed, and dawn began to break over the horizon as they reached the border. Carlos had connections on the other side, a safe house where they could lay low, regroup. But the moment they pulled up to the checkpoint, Sophia felt something shift in the air. There were too many guards, their eyes trained on the approaching car. Carlos slowed down, his hand tightening on the wheel. "They know," he said under his breath, his jaw clenched. "Someone tipped them off." Panic surged through Sophia. "What do we do? Turn back?" Carlos shook his head. "There's no turning back. Not anymore." The car inched forward, and Carlos leaned toward Sophia, his voice low. "Listen carefully. You're going to get out of this car and walk through the checkpoint alone. Tell them you're a lawyer, that you had no idea who I was. They'll let you go." Sophia's chest tightened. "No. I'm not leaving you." Carlos turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. "You have to. This is the only way you survive. If you stay, we both die." Tears stung Sophia's eyes. She knew he was right. But leaving him, walking away, felt like tearing her soul apart. She had crossed too many lines, made too many sacrifices to give up now. She had fought for him, loved him, and now, in this moment of life and death, she was supposed to walk away? Carlos's hand found hers, gripping it tight. "Sophia," he said, his voice soft but urgent, "I never wanted this for you. You deserve better. You deserve a life." She swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart breaking. "What about you? What happens to you?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The moment she stepped out of the car, Carlos would be a dead man. He knew it. And so did she. "I love you," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. Carlos nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know." With that, Sophia opened the car door, stepping into the harsh morning light. She forced herself to keep moving, to walk toward the checkpoint. Each step felt like it took a lifetime, her legs heavy with the weight of what she was leaving behind. She reached the guards, barely registering their questions as she gave them the story she and Carlos had prepared. But as she walked through the checkpoint, her heart shattered. The sound of screeching tires ripped through the air. Sophia spun around just in time to see Carlos' car speeding away, heading back toward the open road. The guards shouted, scrambling to respond, but Sophia barely heard them. Carlos wasn't going to surrender. He was going to run. Sophia watched as the car disappeared into the distance, her breath catching in her throat. For a brief moment, she thought he might make it, escape into the wilderness, disappear like he always did. Then came the gunfire. The shots echoed across the desert, and Sophia's knees buckled. The guards surrounded her, pulling her back, but she barely registered their presence. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the plume of dust that rose from where the car had gone. It was over. Months passed, and Sophia tried to rebuild her life. She returned to the city to her legal practice, but everything had changed. The media had spun her connection to Carlos into a salacious scandal, and the whispers followed her wherever she went. Her career, once full of promise, had become a ghost of what it once was. But the worst part was the emptiness. Carlos was gone, his life claimed by the world he had tried so hard to escape. And Sofia, despite everything, couldn't shake the memory of him. The man who had loved her, fought for her, and ultimately saved her. Late at night, when the city was quiet and the world had gone to sleep, Sofia would sit by her window, staring out at the lights, wondering if there had been another way. If she could have saved him. If they could have had a different ending. But deep down, she knew the truth. There was no happy ending for people like them. Only love, fleeting and fierce, in the crosshairs of a world too dangerous to survive.